So Chapter 2 moves into designing and assessing 21st century learning. And if you hadn't figured out, I am using the, I believe, 11th version of the text rather than the brand newest version. So for this one, we're going to talk about the similarities and differences in some different learning theories. We're going to list the 8 principles of effective instruction for 21st century learners, look at the similarities and differences in the principles of effective technology and media utilization, and describe the similarities and differences in the types of effective learning assessments. When we're talking about learning, we're talking about the development of new knowledge, skills, or attitudes as an individual interacts with information and the environment. So teachers need to take some type of role and make some decisions to ensure that learning is going to take place. And especially when integrating technology and media into lessons, we really need to look at the what we're introducing and why we're actually doing that. So when we think about different learning theories, there have been several major ones that have come out. So the behaviorist, that is B.F. Skinner from the 1950s. He was talking about different scientific studies that looked at observable behavior. So he was interested in voluntary behaviors such as learning new skills rather than reflective behaviors like what Pavlov looked at. So he looked at reinforcing and rewarding desired responses. Could that shape the behavior patterns of the organism? So he specifically worked with pigeons and looked at the reinforcement theory. He noted that when pigeons were given a reward for a desired behavior, they tended to repeat it. If the pigeons didn't receive that reinforcement, then they decided to stop the behavior. So he reasoned that the same procedures could be used with humans, and this helped become the foundation for computer-assisted instruction. He wasn't really looking at internally what was happening, only at observable behaviors. And so for this, it typically relies on lower level behaviors, not real higher order thinking skills. So then when you look at the cognitivist perspective, I can't say that one very well. Cognitivism was based on the work of Piaget from the 1970s, where he explored the mental processes of individuals when they responded to their environment. So he's more looking at how people think, solve problems, and make decisions. So if a behaviorist encounters something, then whatever it is goes into their short-term memory, and the more they use whatever it is, then it may transfer over into the long-term memory. But if they don't really use it, then it fades to make room for more learning to happen. And cognitivists really look a little more at they don't think that the students are as dependent on the teacher, but they rely more on their own cognitive strategies when using learning resources. So some have said that it's a good compromise between required benchmarks, those standards that, that students are tested, all at the same time, and metacognition, which is thinking about one's own learning. Now, constructivism is much more what takes place in a student-centered classroom, and this is where you take the ideas beyond cognitivism, where you look at the engagement of students in a meaningful experience, and that's the entire basis of experiential learning. So you're taking, shifting from that passive transfer of information from the teacher to the student to an active problem solving and discovery mode, where the students get to create their own interpretations of the world of information around them. So the role of a constructivist instruction would be to provide students with ways to assemble knowledge rather than just dispensing facts. Constructivists believe that the learning occurs most effectively when students are engaged and authentic tasks that relate to meaningful contexts. So learning by doing. And this is much more, this is the approach that fits the best with 21st century learners who need to learn how to solve problems and not only capitalize on their existing knowledge, but also requires those learners to seek additional information or develop skills to help them find the most effective solution. And then one final perspective is social psychology. And this is a well-established approach where the study of instruction and learning looks at the social organization of a classroom and how it affects the learning. So this is where you look at the group structure of the classroom. Do you only have independent study? Do you put your students into small groups, or do you lecture the class as a whole? What is the authority structure? How much control do students have over their activities and what they get to choose to do? So when you look at like Robert Slavin in the 1990s, he's taken the position that cooperative learning is both more effective and more socially beneficial to the competitive and individualistic learning that takes place. And when we are trying to develop 21st century workers, then we need to think in terms of this social psychology, psychological perspective, where we are looking at students and how they work in groups. Are they able to form relationships and solve problems dependently with other students, or do they only want to, kind of go off into a corner and work by themselves? And I would recommend not choosing one particular type, but really look at your entire classroom or your group of learners, depending on, if you've got a separate class or if you have a group of learners that maybe are adult learners, and some tasks lend themselves better to a constructivist approach, and others are definitely much more social, psychological, where you need that group working together. So when really thinking about engaging students in the learning process, you can look at the research-based classroom practices that have been found to engage learners, which have evolved over time. So before you can really provide instruction, you need to assess their prior knowledge. You need to look at individual differences. You need to have stated objectives for you and your students to know where the instruction's going and what needs to be accomplished to be able to get to that point. And they need to match the expected outcomes or standards that you're trying to match those with. You need to help develop metacognitive skills. So those are the skills of monitoring and evaluating and adjusting your approach to enhance your students' learning. That's making those adjustments as you go to help develop those lifelong learners. You need to provide some sort of social interaction at some point in time within your classroom. You need to incorporate realistic contexts. You need to engage your students in relevant practice, not just, I don't know how many times you had to hear a student say, when are we ever going to use this? If students don't believe in what they're doing, they have a much harder time investing in the knowledge that they're learning. And as an educator, you need to offer frequent, timely, and constructive feedback to your learners so they can kind of self-check and monitor their own progress. So as you get further into Chapter 2, if you'll look at the difference between information versus instruction, students should not ever just be expected to be responsible for retaining and using information that they've only seen or heard one time. If you are going to offer some type of job aid, some type of short guide to help the user that's not really meant to be memorized, but something that they would go back and refer to, that's more of like coaching the individual. So instruction, on the other hand, is an intentional effort to stimulate learning by the deliberate arrangement of experiences that help the learners really achieve a desirable change in capability. So be thinking in terms of what you do in your instruction, instructional practices, whether or not you are relying on just a one-time hit or miss scattering of information that you give to your students, or are you truly instructing them and offering strategies and the technology and the media that will help the students really internalize the learning rather than just acquiring some information. I would definitely recommend reading through the Bloom's Digital Taxonomy and 21st Century, the 4 C's. Unfortunately, the Partnership for 21st Century Skills website is no longer available. It was a fantastic resource that really showed teachers how to collaborate and plan and develop 21st century digital learning opportunities for their students to really embrace technology. But like I said, that one is no longer available. Now the Global School Net should still be available, so you might want to go through there. And also in the ISTE website, you should be able to find different ways to incorporate true technology integration rather than just kind of throwing technology at the students. Thinking about meeting your learners' needs. Again, we're going to talk about assistive technology that can really help students develop as a 21st century learner. And as you scroll down through or read through the rest of your text, you do want to look at the principles of effective media utilization to make sure that you are meeting the media literacy needs of your students, the text, the audio, the visual, all of the different media that they will come in contact with. And we also need to be looking at effective assessments, those authentic assessments that really help the student know whether or not they have met whatever your learning standards you were trying to get them to accomplish. So when you use checklists or rubrics, you can really show your students they can even assess themselves and know whether or not they have met those learning benchmarks that maybe you have set for all of your students to meet. Now there is still a place for traditional assessment as well, where if you as the teacher need to verify that students have specific knowledge or skills, you can go back to the old multiple choice, fill in the blank, true, false, any of those types of assessments, because when you do get to your standardized tests, they will typically be responsible for, demonstrating those types of learning information. So there is definitely still a time and a place for traditional assessments, but when you're really looking at projects, you can look at a portfolio or even a rubric assessment. And that was one thing I was going to point out. There are 3 great tools that can help you design some of the best rubrics that you can to make sure that you are assessing your learners in a fashion that makes sense, that matches what your intentions were and the standards that you were making sure that they lived up to.